Okay, awesome. So we'll get this thing started. This is a project that should take approximately a year in total. This is a set of games that originally took place between in the 1950s and 1950s and 60s both, I believe. And the games are from a book called My 60 Memorable Games by Bobby Fischer. And Bobby Fischer was one of the world chess champions, and he's quite a world-renowned player because he took on the entirety of the Russian armada on his lonesome. And he was able to defeat sort of this conglomerate, this entire Russian conglomerate, at a time when chess actually became quite political. So during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the fight between the United States and the Russians had gotten to be quite the tensions were quite high. And because the tensions were quite high, a lot of the people at the time wanted to make the issue of intelligence one of the sort of defining factors between the two nations, let's say the Russians and the Americans. And as such, the game of chess, which is, I guess, associated with intellect, naturally, became one of the forefront runners of the political atmosphere. So that brought the world champion that we'll be talking about, Bobby Fischer, and this set of games to somewhat fame and prominence in the national eye. The interesting things about these games is they span the entirety of Fischer's career. So there's a lot of world championship material here, as well as just state level championship and national level championship games. With that, we'll get started. I guess one more thing that I want to add, I don't know if now is the best time to do it, but I'll go ahead and read this snippet, which is by a grandmaster by the name of Grandmaster Larry Evans. And International Grandmaster Larry Evans gave an introduction to each one of the games in the book, which is a sort of analysis of the game. The reason that I'm saying that I don't know if it's the best time now to explain it is because, I'll read it first. So it says, although Sherwin makes no serious errors in the opening, he misses several equalizing opportunities. Demonstrating the technical virtuosity that is to become his hallmark, Fischer, with astonishing maturity, gradually strengthens his grip by accumulating small advantages. The better center and the two bishops. Sherwin, meanwhile, attempts to consolidate his position, only to see his 14-year-old opponent shatter it with a thunderbolt on move 18. It brings to mind Alfheim's combinations, which also seem to spring from nowhere. Sherwin, lashing back, refuses to fall. However, his defense finally integrates under a series of acute blows to his wobbly king. I'll also read this one more time after the game, so that you can see what he means by the better center, the two bishops, the thunderbolt of the move, and the acute blows to the wobbly king. But again, the game is a Sicilian defense. It starts off with e4, c5, knight f3, e6, and d3. The book that I'm looking at actually has this not in algebraic notation, but in the Old King's edition, which reads pawn king 4, pawn q b4, knight to king's bishop 3, pawn to king 3, and pawn to queen 3. They're both really interesting ways of denotating the game, and I'm happy to read both, or I can pick one or the other depending on whatever the general consensus is. But Fischer writes that this used to be one of his favorites, and that he thought it led to a favorable variation of the King's Indians reversed, particularly after Black has committed himself with pawn to king 3, or e6. So, g3, knight to f6, and bishop to g2. Here Fischer gives another game from Fischer v. Ivkov, Santa Monica. Continues pawn after move 4, pawn to queen 4, um, queen's knight to queen 2, bishop to queen 3, bishop to knight 2, king's knight to king 2, both sides castling, and knight to rook 4 with chances of initiative. That game is something like 3 and 6, 9 years later. So it just goes to show that when Fischer is annotating these games, he's looking back on them as opposed to looking at the games from immediately after he played them. After bishop to e7, both sides castle. And here Fischer writes that more usual is pawn to queen 4, which is namely d5, but black has purposely delayed placing his center pawns. Has he a new idea in mind? So after queen's knight to queen 2, or knight bd2, we have a position that Fischer gives: pawns to king knight, 9 to queen 4, queen's knight to queen 2, pawns bishop to 3, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and pawn to king 1, which gives white an edge. I suppose that there are ways to assess these annotations in other analyses, and I'm happy to go over these analyses if they're of interest to the viewer, but that would be significantly longer in terms of the view time. It would turn up to an hour or so of just video making as opposed to like 15 or 20 minutes. So if that's of interest, just let me know and I can analyze the variations in longer form videos. But we have rook to e1. Excuse me, give me 1 second. Okay. So, after rook to e1 and rook to b8, Fischer notes that Sherwin slid the rook to b8 with his pinky finger so as to emphasize the surreptitiousness of the move. Of course, it's always interesting, the annotations, if and when the authors decide to take note of certain things that are done that describe the over-the-board play. It adds a little bit of personality to the notation in the games. Instead of strictly speaking, the variations that are given, which are more technical and analytical in terms of their description. So c3, b6, d4, queen to c7, e5 here, and knight to d5. Fischer says that queen to c7 is actually a mistake, and that it leads to trouble, where instead black should be starving for counterplay by trying to open the c file, the queen's bishop file, by taking pawns and then trying another route. But for what it's worth, it's harder to tell immediately that this variation gives black trouble. Fischer really enjoys the move knight to e4 here. It says that it forces black to, excuse me, sorry about that, to an unpleasant choice where he has to protect against c4. And the way that Sherwin defends against this is by playing c4 himself. After which Fischer likes the position that he's in, because now he has this threat of f5 acting on the diagonal, the f4 b8 diagonal, and it lends itself to attacking opportunities if he's somehow able to dislodge the knight and cramp black. So after knight to g5, knight to e7, and queen to